Do you think Canada is a systemically racist country? If you ask the prime minister or a public school teacher or anyone in between, that question has probably already been answered and shut in the affirmative that yes, we have a problem with systemic racism. So ingrained is the federal government's belief that we have a problem with systemic racism that solutions are woven into the government's programs. We'll get into that in a little while. But is it actually true? Are we really systemically racist? Is this merely opinion, or is this belief actually based in fact? What does the research say? Well, joining me today to discuss his analysis and research is Matthew Lau, a writer and senior fellow with the Aristotle Foundation. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me today to share some of your findings. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to start initially. What compelled you to want to write and analyze the facts on this topic of systemic racism?
Well, the main thing is that this is something that has a significant impact on our public policy here in Canada. Um, you can see, for example, that the Prime Minister's mandate letters to his cabinet ministers instructs them to address profound systemic inequities and disparities in our core institutions. If you look at other government documents, including strategy papers, you'll find references to systemic racism and discrimination, or institutional racism, or other such phrases. So we know that this is something that is guiding federal policy and probably a lot of policies at other levels of government as well. So if government policy and public money is being spent according to the premise that Canada is systemically racist, and I think it's important to define that term as well.
Right.
The way the federal government defines systemic racism it consists of patterns or behavior or policies or practices that are part of a social or administrative structures that creates a position of relative disadvantage for racialized persons or for minority groups. So that's what we're really talking about here, and that idea is, as I said, informs the way that the government spends money and sets regulations. So we wanted to examine whether this claim is true.
And again, a very interesting approach when we look at this, because I would assume that the government would have had to have asked that question: Are we systemically racist? And to do that, they would have had to look into the research. What does the research say? What are and I'm not a big fan of this, but is there equality of outcome? Like, what are the outcomes saying? That's how one would measure versus equality of opportunities in that regard. So, what did the research say? What have you discovered in this process?
Well, certainly one way to look at it is if Canada was a systemically racist country in which minority groups were systemically disadvantaged and white people had discriminatory power, one thing we would expect to see is that if you look at, for example, economic outcomes, that white people would be at the top of the ladder and and that the minority groups would be at the bottom. When we look at the data, we see no such thing, and Statistics Canada has published data on this. For example, from the 2016 census, they showed average weekly earnings of Canadian born men and women from 10 visible minority groups versus their white counterparts. And among men, we find that 4 of the 10 minority groups have higher average weekly earnings than the white population. And among women, it's 7. So this statistic rather goes against the fact that white people have a systemic advantage in our country, at least economically, when you look at the data on incomes.
Yeah, it definitely does throw a wrench into that in mentality or that thinking. And I appreciate what you said, that we do really need to examine the data, because if this is the driving force behind government policy, and we know not only is there social ramifications for government policy, there's financial and economical ramifications for government policy. So we have to really unpack that and see. So may I ask, what were some of out of the 4 for the men, what were the racial groups that were outperforming the whites? Not that this is a competition, but.
Well, on average in Canada, and we see the same in the United States actually, is that Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and South Asian men and women, on average, tend to have higher average weekly earnings than their white counterparts. And actually, if you dig further into the data, you'll see some some interesting statistics. For example,
Okay, I'm going to
Filipino
pause you
men.
there. Could we come back and pick up that example in just a few moments? We'll be right back.
Absolutely.